She had planned to be invisible. Isabella Reyes had learned the value of smallness the hard way. It kept trouble from finding you. It preserved the dignity of her mother, who scrubbed other people's mansions, while the bills stacked up like winterwood. It let her move through the hospital corridors with steady hands and a practiced smile, the way nurses learn to keep the world from tipping for someone else. She intended to stay a week, 3 at most Rosa shifts until the cough that settled in her mother's ribs loosened. 1 week to make rent, 1 week to keep Rosa from worrying, 1 week and then back to the cramped apartment above the bodega where the radiator clanged like a metronome. Then the phone call in the ambulance bay changed that plan. I can't keep my head up, Mia, her mother said, voice thin as tissue but stubborn. They tell me it's pneumonia. The doctor says rest. You can go. A cough cut her off. You can handle Mr. Castellano is a place for a beat. See? Like always. Isabella pictured the narrow bed, the faded blanket her mother smoothed every morning. She could feel the weight of the unpaid bills in the stack by the phone. She could picture the empty spaces where pride might live if she let it. She said yes because there was no elegant alternative, and because saying no would have sounded like abandonment. But on my terms? She added, and meant it. She had noticed the way Rosa's back straightened when she said it. There were 2 important things she needed: dignity and money. Not in that order. She would not go back to polishing silver under the assumption that she owed gratitude for every coin. If she was to step into the Castellano estate, she would do it on her feet. She arrived 2 days later with a duffel bag and a stubborn set to her jaw. The drive from Brooklyn to the uptown enclave felt like traveling through another light towers of glass and polished cars that reflected the sky back at itself, trees manicured into shapes that hinted at control. The Castellano gates were an arch of iron that swallowed the streetlight. Beyond them the mansion crouched like a secret, stone and shadow and ivy, windows lit against the coming dusk. The gate god eyed her before the engine rolled to a stop, taking in the scuffed boots and the cheap jacket, and the way she touched the strap of her bag, as though it might slip away. He tapped his earpiece, glanced at the clipboard, and then at the brass nameplate on her duffel. Reyes. The guard's expression was a question in the shape of suspicion. She's Rosa's girl, he said into the radio, the way someone recited a detail that could be checked later. Then he looked at her. You have an appointment? I have a shift, Isabella said. Her voice was level. My mother's off sick. She asked me to cover for a week. The man's eyes flicked past her to the street, the kind of skip a person makes when trying to find a lie. The gate heaved open like a slow animal. The road up the drive was framed by winter trees and stone lanterns that made the snowless grounds gleam. By the time Isabella stepped from the car, the manor's front door was a silhouette, formidable and refusing, as if it kept its own heart private. She had rehearsed the terms on the ride over. No uniform. Double pay. No arrangement to work overnight without notice. She would not be another invisible body in the house. If they wanted her labor, they would respect her dignity. Inside, the air was warmer than she expected, perfumed and old money clean. A woman in a black wool coat watched from the threshold, hands clasped as if in prayer to discipline. Maggie Stone, the house manager, had a face made of stern lines and the kind of authority that did not require volume. Her eyes took Isabella in and did not smile. You're late, Maggie said. Precisely. Traffic, Isabella replied. My mother? Rosa's ill. Maggie's voice softened just enough that Isabella felt the difference. I've been told you're dependable. Rosa said she left a list, Isabella said. I can. A door opened deeper in the house, and a man stepped into the corridor like a shadow taking shape. He was taller than the pictures that leaked from rumor. Rumor had made him mythic, a man with a reputation that could smooth the tongues of politicians. Maxwell Castellano looked like someone carved from a colder stone broad, hair cut back like the arch of a blade, hands that looked used to making decisions. His eyes were not curious. They were precise instruments. He measured Isabella as one would measure a patient, with the diagnostic calm of a man who had once been trained to understand the body and now kept people at arm's length. You're Rosa's girl, he said, voice even. Yes. She kept her head high. I can take over for a week. I don't work for tips. He observed her for a moment that felt like a small surgical exam, no touch, only the turning of his gaze. Do you have experience in fine household care? I worked in a clinic. I can handle linens, medications, schedules. She put the rest in. I keep my hands clean and my back straight. She wanted to show him competence the way people show documents. Neat, undeniable. He considered this, and the corridor held its breath. We have staff, he said, as if reminding her of a fact. We have uniforms. You will be expected to conform. Isabella had practiced the refusal more than the yes. I'll do the work, she said, but not the uniform. I won't be made invisible, and I'll need double pay. There was a small, almost invisible shift in Max's expression, like a minor chord resolving into a note with a timbre he hadn't expected. He did not scoff. He did not scorn. He simply asked, "And why double pay?" "My mother's sick," she said. "My rent is a mountain. I have the training of a nurse, but not the degrees to keep me from the small rooms of the city. I can do the work. I won't apologize for what I need." It was the sort of answer that could be hush. Many who stood before Max would have crumbled under the implied danger of being dismissed. Isabella's refusal to be reduced was not loud. It was a tight, efficient honesty that had the shape of survival. He nodded once. 2 weeks, he said finally. 1 week's wage up front. You keep your clothes. No public presence at any official functions unless specifically requested. You stay within the staff areas, unless she could have asked for more. She didn't. Agreements were not made in bravado, but in a She took the envelope he handed across the mahogany desk, like a small victory, as if the weight of it could anchor the night. The check was heavier than she expected. "Welcome," Max said. "We'll see how you fit." That was the bargain. She would fit or she would be asked to leave. The house had rules. He had given her the tiniest latitude within them. She accepted it like a soldier accepting a truce. If she had gone in expecting compassion, she would have been disappointed. If she had wanted to be invisible, she would have failed. Instead, she left the study with the envelope tucked against her ribs and a resolve that fit like armor. Once the formalities were done, she met the rest of the staff. Cooks who moved with the ease of those who had spent days inventing systems of silence. Maids with faces like lived-in novels. The gardener who smudged soil on his knuckles and spoke to the plants as if they were relatives. Isabella fell into the work with the rhythm of someone who had always been saving other people, folding linen with a surgeon's precision, organizing medicine that smelled of antiseptic and lavender, running checks on the schedule the way a nurse would check vitals. She was competent, quick, and quietly efficient. The house bent around her ability like water around a stone. She noticed details other people missed, the way the chandeliers dimmed at a certain hour, the hidden kitchen where staff ate meals without crystal and silver, the small staircase that led to the service corridor, its steps worn each in different places as if by centuries of hurried feet. She learned the names of the rooms and the rules associated with them. Which doors remained locked at night. Which windows would let in the air of the city? Which rooms were permitted to feel like home and which were only for function? Max noticed the way she moved. He was used to noticing. There were cameras, of course, more than the necessary amounts that watched for security rather than curiosity. He had them for reasons he seldom spared out loud. That the footage would become evidence later was a thought he had tucked away in a drawer of practicality. For now, he watched her in softer lights. His curiosity a measured thing. Word traveled up and down the staff like a wind on a tightrope. "Rose's daughter is sharp," someone said in the kitchen, as if sharing gossip that softened to camaraderie. The house smelled like roasting mead and lemon polish and the faint temps of the cellars. The cellar itself had an old silence, a place where time compressed. It would later become a room where the past could be touched like aged oak. For the moment, it was merely a place Isabella learned to navigate when inventory duties required her presence. On the third day, the house was alive with preparations. There was to be an intimate dinner. Nothing ostentatious, a select group of benefactors and friends to discuss the foundation Max had been rumored to sponsor. The wine cellar needed cataloging. The silver had to be polished to a level that caught the lamplight like a mirror. Vanessa Thornton arrived the evening before the dinner. She arrived, like one of the chandeliers, in human form bright high, and designed to be admired. Her dresses were a study in expensive tailoring. Her smile had the mechanical perfection of someone who had learned their face for public consumption. She moved like a woman who had been given the map of where she belonged and had never doubted the road. Vanessa had been seen with Max in the papers, posed elegantly at charity galas, her laugh the kind that made headlines. She had the habit of orbiting the most lethal insiders and reflecting their power with her own polished surface. When Isabella saw her for the first time, she felt something she hadn't expected, a flare of alarm. As if an animal in a smaller forest suddenly saw a lion. New face. Vanessa asked the staff at dinner like a queen testing the loyalty of subjects. "That's Rose's daughter," Maggie said. "She's covering for a week." Vanessa turned, and the room tightened around the friction of two women sizing one another up. Isabella's cheeks warmed, not from shame but from the heat of being acknowledged by someone who treated the world as a stage. Vanessa's eyes traveled from her jacket to the envelope that, in Isabella's mind, embodied months of rent and 1,000 little necessary things. The glance said, without words, a catalogue of class. "You must be very brave to work here, without the right uniform," Vanessa said. The mocking sweetness of it, pressing at Isabella's throat. Isabella could have asked for grace. She could have let the insult fall like rain and wash away without a fuss. She had rehearsed meekness like a prayer. But there remains a moment in every person's life when the cost of silence outweighs the cost of speaking up. "It's not bravery," Isabella answered, steady. "It's necessity." "Ah," Vanessa purred, delighting in the damage her words could do. How quaint. Necessity is cute on people who don't have elegance to hide behind. The room shifted. A few guests chuckled, the small, polite laugh of those who like conflict, like their coffee bitter and quick. Isabella felt the heat of every head turning toward her. She felt Rose's face in her memory, stern and small, with hands worn like pages in a well-read book. She imagined the bills at home, the exhaustion that kept Rose's voice low. She imagined telling her mother that she had let a woman with a diamond watch call her necessity cute. She said what she did not expect to say. Her hand moved before she could catch it. Her palm met Vanessa's cheek with a sound that seemed lost in the clink of crystal and the hush of the room. It was a clean, sharp rejection, not the flailing slap of a punch, but the precise, measured response of someone who would not let humiliation be his mother's heirloom. The room inhaled. For a beat, sound left the space entirely. Vanessa's face burned with the sudden heat of insults, then contorted in a way that made even the chandeliers look sympathetic. She touched her cheek, as if to soothe a wound she had thought only she could inflict on others. "You'll regret that," Vanessa said, but it sounded small, like a child threatening the sky. Isabella stood routed, pulse thrumming a slow drum. Adrenaline flushed her cheeks, and a terrifying clarity settled in her bones. The slapping line had been crossed. She could be sent away, humiliated, painted as a troublemaker in the papers that loved scandal for breakfast. She had expected a swift dismissal, a public rebuke, the lowering of her world into an even smaller box. Instead, footsteps approached. Max had been in another wing. He had the ability to appear in a room like an eclipse. He came with the sound of purpose and the softness of someone who had learned how to shape silence into authority. He looked at Vanessa, then at Isabella, and for a moment the room was a scale. "You're leaving," Max said to Isabella calmly. "Now." She braced herself for the worst, the feel of her duffel being spat back at her. Her head bowed, the humiliation of being escorted out. But his hand did not move toward the door. He looked at her as if measuring an organ's sound through a stethoscope. "Not out of punishment," he added. "Out of discretion. You'll retire to the staff wing. Change into clean clothes. Bring nothing ostentatious." She obeyed because orders were part of the place. Her feet moved in the way of someone trained to do a job without collapsing. The corridor hummed in the aftershock of the slap. Invisible stitches of gossip pulled taut between the staff. Once she was behind the staff quarter doors, in a small room with a sliver of light like a witness through the curtains. She considered the possible outcomes. The envelope in her bag felt lighter and heavier at once. Money versus pride. She had not expected mercy. She had expected to be crushed. He could have fired her. He could have put a badge on her and made her service a spectacle. Instead, Max did something he used rarely. He intervened on a scale that was not brute force, but a demonstration of authority's subtlety. A shirt was left at her door. It was not one of the staff uniforms with its neat seams and obliging shape. It was a soft, worn thing that smelled faintly of his aftershave and odd domesticity from a man whose public persona was more likely to smell of power than laundry soap. The shirt was larger than she was, and held the shape of someone with broad shoulders. There was a note folded in the collar in handwriting she could not have guessed. Stay. Clean up. You can keep it. There were a dozen ways to read the gesture. It could be an order, a test, an attempt at control, or it could be something sharper. An acknowledgement that the woman who refused silence had value to him beyond the spectacle. The shirt felt to Isabella like an intersection where vulnerability and power met and did not annihilate each other. She folded the shirt around herself in the small room and caught a glimpse of her reflection, eyes that had not always known how to hold fire. A scar near the left collarbone she kept hidden in the summer because it told a story she did not owe anyone. The scar was a map of a struggle, the past. She had not worn it in years, not in the sense of letting it be known, but here, in this shirt that smelled faintly of someone else, she had to reckon with the present. That night, the house was a constellation of closed doors and low conversations. Max, who had once sat through lectures in a hospital classroom with keen eyes, found himself watching the people around him as if treating them as patients. Isabella moved through her tasks with the quiet efficiency that annoyed some and impressed others. The slap had been a dividing line. In one stroke she had erased the camouflage of her own compliance. He had watched the footage later, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to see exactly how it had happened. The tilt of Vanessa's head, the smear of red on a cuff as wine had arced through the air toward Isabella. The security cameras preserved trivialities, a bird-brain memory of emotion no one had meant to capture. On the grainy screen, the sequence was undeniable. Vanessa's hand with the glass, the arc of wine, Isabella's palm connecting with Vanessa's cheek. Max saw the truth, both the small factual truth and the larger context. He understood the way social currency ran through rooms like a current, and he understood that Isabella had chosen to trade her invisibility for a moment of defiance because the currency of dignity is not always something the wealthy can buy. He could have made the problem disappear by a dozen ways that would not have required any moral inventory. He could have hired another woman, paid hush money, orchestrated a rumor. Instead, he did a thing he had done before in other forms. He used power to protect. It was practical. It was also, secretly, a test of who this woman was. When he sent the shirt, the gesture contained a certain gravity. In his private life he had kept things tidy. An account, a ledger, names to be called when decisions needed to be made. But some decisions did not sit well in ledgers. Protecting someone for reasons that had nothing to do with leverage unsettled the neat accounting of his life. Isabella slept poorly, dreams of her mother coughing and her apartment's radiator clanging like a small, tired beast, but the shirt by her side was a thing of warmth. In the morning, she put it on. It swallowed her frame, the sleeves hanging past her clean wrists, and the collar sat over the coin of her collarbone where the scar lived. The fabric was soft, not the scratchy material of uniforms. It fit like someone else's hand on a small, defiant heart. Days passed. She learned the rhythm of the mansion, the way a new neighbor learns the comings and goings of a building, what doors opened at what hours, which rooms would be safe for a conversation, who to avoid when topics grew dangerous. She worked with a steady attention that made even the most distracted staff nod in quiet approval. Room by room she made small improvements that were both invisible and crucial. The pantry, labeled properly. The linen closet, reordered. The medication drawer sorted with the precision of a nurse who knew which few mistakes could be fatal. Sometimes she caught Max watching her from the doorway of his study, sitting like a man who had learned how to measure the temperature of a room without stepping in. Occasionally, he would ask a question, a practical one, about a medicine, an offhand remark about a sound he heard in the night that he couldn't place. He asked, not interrogated? He inquired, and she answered, and little by little, the cold reservoir of the house warmed with human exchange. Not everyone warmed. Vanessa circled like a sparrow with a penchant for picking at the thread of another's coat. She attempted slights that ranged from the elegant to the petty. She left notes on trays that were intentionally incorrect, asked pointed questions that put Rosa in a place of assumed Isabella met each slight with the sturdiness of a woman who had learned to bend only enough to avoid snapping. She kept the shirt's memory as a talisman against what the world expected of her. The staff began to murmur in new ways, less caution, more curiosity. Sophia, Max's sister, was a rare kindness in heels. She had a law student's earnestness, and a laugh that was a little too soft for a family that guarded so much. She sought Isabella out in the kitchen one evening, with a bowl of soup, the way someone offers peace. "You did not have to do that," Sophia said about the slap, puzzlement on her features the way one might study a painting that refuses to be explained in simple terms. "You could have left." "Left what?" Isabella replied. "Silence? Another bill? Shame, as an inheritance." Sophia's jaw tightened. She was not used to observing the world from the margins, and Isabella's presence was a small lens that made her see details her studies did not teach her. "It was brave," Sophia said finally. "It was necessary," Isabella corrected softly. There were glances between the sisters, stew women from different maps of the same city, and unspoken conversations that would find their own terrain later. For the evening, they shared food and the kind of short, honest chatter that allows people to make friends in premeditated ways, where one is from, what one ate as a child, the way the cold makes one both kinder and crueler. Max watched some of this from the library. The lines on his face temporarily softened as if he had been turned down from the edge of something painful. He remembered himself as a younger man with a medical textbook under his arm, plans like pale diagrams. He had once believed in the benevolence of knowledge, in a simpler kind of power that could make people whole. He had a brother, Jonathan, whose laugh still haunted some corners of his memory, a kindness that used to make life palatable, replaced now by the machinery of running a household that doubled as a fortress. Isabella kept her duties, but did not disappear. She had not come to be rescued. She had come because the ledger of her life required it. In being practical, she allowed tenderness to exist in unexpected consequence for both her and the man who had once thought the world required only control. But the house is a place of optics as much as of rooms, and optics can be weaponized. Vanessa, baited by wounded pride and the taste of social theater, decided that the way to wound would be public and humiliating. She waited for the dinner, the gathering for which the cellar had been prepared, and the wine chosen with a care that bordered on reverence. The wine was old, a collector's piece, a testament to a family's tradition and taste. It was meant to be a symbol of continuity and trust. Vanessa slipped into the ballroom like an actress finding her mark. Her rivalries were translated into limericks of eye rolls and raised glasses. The guests whispered and looked like eager gulls, their small appetites for scandal hidden under polite napkins. Isabella carried platters at the edge of the room. Hands steady, eyes down. She avoided animation because to be anonymous is often to be safe. And then the world did what the world does when wounds meet opportunity. Vanessa tilted and wine arced. It was a slow-motion cruelty. The glass left Vanessa's hand and described a dark curve through the lamplight. The red wine cut through the air like a stain not yet placed. It landed across Isabella's shoulder and down the fabric in a precise, visible trail. The room watched, dinnerware frozen in their hands, as the mark widened. Vanessa laughed, like a sound that had no roots. "Look at you," she said, as if she were lecturing a child. "You really did forget to put on the costume." Something inside Isabella became a tool of sharpness. The heat in her palms traveled up to her throat. She did not think. Years of swallowing returned as a memory too bitter to be revisited. She turned and, with a steadiness that bordered on clinical, she placed her palm against Vanessa's cheek. It was not a reaction born of impulse but of a principle practiced in a life that had not come with scripts for shame. Again, the room inhaled. This time the sound was mantra-like, a murmur with the purr of scandal. Vanessa's face colored. The guests found their voices in the ticking of expectation. Some wanted spectacle, others wanted order. The air tasted like the iron of consequences. Isabella expected results. She expected to be unmade by the machinery of power. She expected to feel the heavy machinery of retribution. An accusation whispered to the papers, a public dismissal, a fine that would take months to pay. Instead, something happened that none of them had fully predicted. Max stepped forward not as an executioner but as a judge with a strange mercy. He did not shout. He did not pull any of the blunt instruments of the world he kept in his pocket. He did something cleaner, more chillingly efficient. He made a decision with the cold, clear clarity of someone who had learned the price of ruin. "I will not have this house become a stage for spectacle," he said. His voice had a weight that dulled the clinking of silver. "Vanessa, you will leave now." The command landed like a gavel. Vanessa's protest was the slither of a wounded animal trying to find an edge. She gathered glamour like armor and stormed out, nails clicking against the marble like someone calling the press to attention. Isabella expected retribution that would be personal, ugly. Instead, Max did something that was another kind of century, closed the room to spectacle and opened a different kind of door. He handed her his shirt. She held it and felt the fabric's weight as if she were cradling an agreement between two people who had not yet learned how to speak plainly. It smelled faintly of him, and of lavender, and something older, memory of a life almost chosen and then abandoned. The gesture was not one of claiming but of sheltering. "Wear it," he said quietly. "I'll explain later." No one in that room understood yet the bearings of the moment. For some it would be a minor scandal. For others it was only a gossip glint. For Isabella, it was the first time someone with power had intervened in her fate without taking the currency of shame in return. She wrapped the oversized shirt around herself in the staff wing later that evening, the buttons meeting not at her ribs but loose like a promise. She smoothed the fabric between her fingers and discovered that beneath the cotton the house felt a degree warmer. The scar at her collarbone prickled like a secret. She thought of her mother's cough, of the radiators clanging, of the bills, and of the small, stubborn dignity that refused to be traded. There was more to the story than the shirt, she knew. Authority could be as merciless in its mercy as in its punishment. A protection that came with ledger lines and ultimatums was still protection, but it could be catalogued as an investment rather than a kindness. She did not know where this would lead. She knew only that she had made a choice to refuse diminution, and that choice had been answered in a way that made the pivot point of her life tremble. At the end of the night, she stood by the small window of the staff quarters, watching the mansion breathe in lantern light. The iron gates were a dark mouth in the distance. She cupped a mug of coffee, her fingers warming on the porcelain, and felt the shirt's fabric cool and warm as her pulse moved beneath it. Outside, the city was a ribbon of noise and possibility. Inside, the house hummed with the soft sound of privacy, of secrets not yet aired. When sleep finally took her, it came in jerks. She dreamed of stairs descending of gates that opened and closed, of a hand on her cheek that was both protection and accusation. In the morning, she folded the shirt and placed it back in her duffel, leaving the envelope of wages where she could see it. She had come for 1 week. 2 days later, as she straightened a table in the sunlit morning room, a thought as precise as a scalpel passed through her. One bold refusal had changed everything. Not because it made her famous, but because it forced others to show what they were willing to do when someone refused to be invisible. She did not know yet if she would be saved or punished, elevated or erased. She knew only that she would not shrink back into the life that had kept her mouth closed. The shirt in her bag was a small relic of a decision made in a room with rich floors and the smell of old wine. It was proof that agency could be recognized even in places that prided themselves on erasing voices. Outside, the grounds woke like a creature to be fed. Inside, life resumed its cautious choreography. The wine cellar, catalogued and quiet, waited for an order that had not yet been placed. The cameras, unblinking, kept their grainy neutral memory of everything that had happened. The mansion was a house of many rooms, and the rooms would each keep their own stories. Isabella folded linens and kept watch over the small things. She reminded herself of nursing phrases that applied to more than bodies. Observe, document, attend. If people were things to be tended at all, then dignity could be a wound to dress, not a scar to look at, and move on. She made her list, checked it twice, and set it down like a map that might guide her when storms came. And storms would come. There was a knock at the staff quarter door, that afternoon, sharp, businesslike. She opened it to find Maggie with a tray of tea and a new, unreadable expression on her face. For a moment the two women regarded each other like strangers who had been given a common problem. "You held your ground," Maggie said finally. "Not everyone does." "It was my mother," Isabella replied, not pretending the motives were noble. "She has no one to pay the rent if I don't." Maggie set the tray down with the calm of someone who had stitched many things back together. "Then you have a reason that others don't see. Keep it close." Isabella nodded and took a cup. The tea was too hot, and she burned her lip, grimaced, and smiled after. It was an honest pain, the kind that made a person feel very much in their own skin. She had come to a place of wealth carrying the small, heavy bundle of her life. She had refused to be made small. That refusal had landed her a public slap and a private shirt, attention and protection, in unequal measure. She had no illusions about what it meant to be under the wing of a man whose life was built on both generosity and threat. She knew the ledger of consequences ran both ways, but she also knew something else. The world had shifted around her, and that shift had a momentum. The mansion was full of people who had their own histories and hurts. She had not planned to be the center of any story. She had planned to be invisible. And yet, here she was standing, in a room that smelled of lemon polish and possibility, the taste of the city on her tongue, the memory of her mother in her bones. If this one bold refusal had the power to make a household reckon, to make a fiancé storm and leave, to make a man like Max choose protection over spectacle, then it had done more than shock. It had begun to redraw maps. There were territories Isabella had not yet imagined she could cross, rooms that would become less forbidding, conversations that would stop being laced with subtext. A place in the house that might someday feel less like a workplace and more like a domain of agency. She folded the shirt again, placed it at the bottom of her bag, and set the duffel beside the radiator. Rain began to tap against the windows like a percussion section warming up. Somewhere in the thick of the house, a piano played a single somber key, and Isabella allowed herself a small, private thought. If one bold move could make the sort of noise she had heard, what would happen if she kept moving? She did not know yet. She only knew she had chosen not to be silent. The mansion would answer in its own time. The cameras would hold their images. People would arrange themselves around the new shape she had carved of herself. And somewhere, in a room with a desk ruled by decisions and morality of a pragmatic kind, Maxwell Castellano folded his hands and considered the pattern the woman had left on his world. He found, in the wake of the slap and the shirt, a sound he had not been listening for, a small, steady beat that might, if tended, grow into something like a heart. He did not promise himself absolution. He only promised to observe the consequences of his choices, to measure the cost of protecting as one measures a life in Dosa. The house took a breath, and the story unfolded, room by room, decision by decision. Night in the cellar was different from the house above. It smelled of oak and dust, and the slow patience of things kept for a reason. Isabella had been sent to inventory rows of bottles that afternoon. The ledger required hands as steady as hers, and the cellar had always been a place where time gathered in the staves of barrels and the labels of bottles. She worked by the beam of a single lamp, the pages of the ledger catching the light like a promise written in small print. He found her there as if drawn by the same hush. Max stood in the doorway long enough for the darkness to frame him, his silhouette, a practiced shadow against the glow of the lamp. Up close, the lines that rumor sharpened into menace smoothed into something more human. A man tired around the edges, with a patience he did not waste. "You're still here," he observed. "I like to count what can be counted," she said. "It keeps the parts that are reckless from rising." He smiled the briefest tilt that never reached his eyes and set a bottle onto the table as if he, too, wanted to be part of the practical. The cellar's air wrapped around them, closer than polite rooms, and something in the hush allowed speech that halls and salons did not. "You know about wine," he said after a moment, because curiosity was a surgical thing for him. "You take notes the way some people take pulses." "I take inventory of what needs to be kept," Isabella answered. people, too. Sometimes, their conversation dropped to that small, steady cadence that builds trust in English. He asked about Rusa's cough, and she gave the simple medical facts with the clarity that nurses learn to offer: rest, hydration, antibiotics if the symptoms persist. He asked about schedules and medicine cabinets, and the way certain rooms absorb silence. She answered, and each answer was an arrow that found its mark in his watchful mind. There was a moment when she set the ledger down, and the lamp threw her profile into the shadows like a study. He noticed the curve of her collar as if it might tell a story. She felt his gaze brush the place she avoided and mirrors the faint line along her collarbone that she kept tucked beneath shirts and summer hems. She had not spoken about it. She had learned to carry it like an old coin. "You have a scar," he said softly, not unkindly. "I see it." She stiffened a fraction, then relaxed. It was still hers. "No one could deny a mark that belonged to you." "It's old," she said. "Not dangerous." "Scars are stories people haven't asked for," he replied, and the words had the neutral tone of a man who had learned how to name pain without needing to own it. She found herself telling him the outline of what had happened, not the graphic details, only the facts, like a clinician would record in a file on abusive marriage, an exit, the cost of leaving. She spoke of the nights when fear had been a presence in the apartment and how leaving had been a process that required planning and courage instead of a single decisive act. She spoke of the quiet victories, the first night alone without being watched, the first paycheck safe in an envelope. He listened like a surgeon listening to a murmur in a chest. When she mentioned her brother's Namato, her voice softened. He had died young, a detail she had rarely surrendered to conversation. Max let silence hold the fact, rather than weight it with pity. "My brother Jonathan died when I was still thinking in different terms," he said after a while, choosing his words as if arranging pebbles in a river. "We wanted to do different things once. He wanted to study medicine. Left the path when certain choices became necessary." He did not offer a confession so much as a map of regret. They were two people who had loved and lost, who had learned to make choices out of survival, and who now, for the first time in years, had someone else's gaze to measure those decisions against. The cellar, with its private light, allowed them to speak of things that the rest of the house made a performance out of: regret, grief, the strange economy of giving up a dream for a name. "You once planned to be a doctor," Isabella said, surprising herself with the gentleness of the curiosity. "I had books with notes in the margins," he answered. "My brother had the laugh that made everything possible." When he stopped, because some silences are a shield rather than escape. When he was gone, the choices changed. They spoke about medicine not as a career but as a language. They had almost shared he with the memory of a life he didn't take. She with the knowledge that healing did not need retraining to be effective. She told him about community clinics she'd worked in, about the way the elderly liked consistent voices and the way young kids responded to a certain steadiness. He listened and asked details, and in each question there was a measure of respect she had not expected. At one point, she laughed a short. On his sound end, he watched it like a man noticing light through a curtain for the first time in a while. He told her something he rarely admitted, that the part of him that catalogued names and numbers had never stopped admiring the measure of a person who could hold the space between need and dignity. In response, she asked him without irony what he cared for now. He said, "Order, family, the things that prevent chaos." "Isn't family sometimes the business of the house?" she asked. "Not always," he answered. "Sometimes family is what you repair at great cost. Sometimes family is a ledger you refuse to balance at the expense of someone else." They worked through the night cataloging bottles and, between numbers, threading small truths. He told her about Jonathan's notebooks, about notes on the back of class handouts that he kept as if they were relics. She told him how Mateo had loved to whistle when he thought no one was listening. They were two people comparing margins in books they had once thought would define them. When he left, he did not promise anything. He walked away with the same measured steps he used walking into a room of men who expected answers. But something unlatched inside both of them that night. It was not an epiphany. It was the small, steady knowledge that they had discovered each other as more than a rumor's caricature. For Isabella, the knowledge was bright as a small coin. For Max, it was as dangerous as a new seed. Days folded into preparation. The wine launch-in event meant to showcase the Castellano name as a patron of the arts rather than an owner of secrets took over the household's energy. The guest list contained donors, press, and figures who kept their hands clean with the aid of opulent dinners. The cellar hummed with activity. Chef's orders multiplied. A florist arrived with boxers of pale roses that smelled faintly of bitterness. The evening would be photographed and reported upon, every laugh curated to protect reputations. Vanessa moved through the rehearsals like a rehearsed note herself. She smiled 4 cameras in practice runs and arranged dressings that could be read as stage directions. Here is the image of a woman who is secure in her world. Her presence at the event was a statement. The Castellano name belonged to a certain idea of control, and she embodied it. Isabella worked the staff lines with the even attention of someone who understood that these events required exactitude. She moved through rooms in a practical ballet serving, correcting a placement with the same care she once afforded to a patience for her competence, earning small nods from the kitchen and the kind of gratitude that made her feel sturdy. The night of the launch arrived like a tide. Guests arrived in cars that whispered as they pulled up, and the house filled with the music of small talk. Isabella's tasks were simple but necessary. Keep the flow of the service, ensure the right wine hit the right table at the right moment. She had not expected to be at the center of any contingency. Then the sabotage happened like a quiet, deliberate theft. A bottle that had been reserved as a Chopisan aged vintage that was to be opened ceremonially was cracked open early, replaced with something that looked like it but would belch a sourness into the air when poured. The switch was a small cruelty, with the potential to ruin the evening's tone. Around a table, the wrong wine would be noticed as a flaw, and flaws in such rooms spread like contagion. Vanessa had been seen near the cellar earlier that day, a fact the staff would later repeat in whispers. She had access without suspicion because she had been given access by her proximity to Max. She had the confidence that comes to people who have never had to justify their presence. At the peak moment when glasses were lifted and the cameras angled, they uncorked the wrong bottle. The audience's reaction was eager at first. Some mouths puckered, others smiled through mealtime refinement. A guest coughed politely. There was a ripple of discomfort that could have become a scandal in print if the wrong pen got a hold of it. Vanessa, who had been practiced at performance, chose to sustain the narrative she wanted. She turned toward a cluster of the press and, with the precise cruelty of someone trained to weaponize charm, she claimed to have seen Isabella in the cellar acting suspiciously, implying that the house staff had orchestrated the switch for a laugh. Her accusation was the sort of thing that could be fed to hungry columnists by morning. Isabella, who had been serving nearby, felt the weight of accusation like a hand pressing into her chest. She did not approach the accusers. She did not do anything theatrical. She had learned after the slap that her actions had consequences, and she chose a careful response. She went to the security room. Max had already been watching, as he often did, not to micromanage, but to understand. He found the footage of the cellar that afternoon, the grainy black and white video where small things became indictments. He watched frames like a man reading a file. There, clear as day, the footage showed Vanessa by the racks, fingers brushing dust, then walking away with a small, secretive tilt. Later frames revealed the switch. It was small, but in a room that fed on narrative. Smallness mattered. He called the guests to attention with a voice that drew its power from the same source that kept the household running. Authority, there is a different kind of quiet that the powerful possess. It silences not by volume, but by presence. Cameras turned toward him more for the promise of content than the need for leadership. He took that content and used it in a way no one on the guest list anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have footage that clarifies tonight's events." He did not shout Vanessa down. He invited the clip to speak for itself. The surveillance footage played on the screens set up for the Foundation's presentation, and the room watched itself in black and white. Vanessa's hand was there, a pale ghost among labels. The action was undeniable. The shift from suspicion to certainty moved through the crowd, like a current. Cameras recorded the revelation, cell phones lifted as if to collect proof. Vanessa's face dissolved from practiced amusement to a public kind of fury. The reporters moved like wolves. Some guests shifted their allegiance like a gust changing course. The hum of potential scandal collapsed into a single fact. The person who had tried to make spectacle had been captured, making it. Max did what had the effect of law in a house that often negotiated its own justice. He held the footage up not as leverage for a vendetta, but as a demonstration. Truth could also be a form of order. He addressed the guests with the kind of clarity that made rumor feel cheap. "We do not tolerate sabotage," he said. "This household honors the work of people who keep it. If anyone has complaints, there is a process. Attempting to manufacture scandal for personal theater will not be rewarded here." He did not spend words on vengeance. He did not make a show of revenge. Vanessa left that night with fury and the taste of public censure. Isabella felt something in the room shift in her favor. She had been defended in a way that did not require her to become a spectacle. He had shown, in front of patrons and press, that he would use the cameras not to erase, but to vindicate. Still, not all consequences were settled by footage. The day after the launch, the paper's feed carried whispers and a social media thread that tried to turn the event into commentary. Power, even when it shields, draws scorn, as well as gratitude. Max knew this. That was why his defense had been measured and legal, rather than theatrical. He was not interested in being a savior in the gilded sense. He wanted to signal a limit to the house, a rule that would be enforced. In the days that followed, Isabella felt the pressure lift and also tighten in ways she could not yet name. She had been vindicated, but the world remained complicated. People's loyalties shifted along with the winds. Some staff were warmer now, some patrons more curious. Sophia's smile met hers when their paths crossed, and the warmth that had at first been simple civility grew into a modest companionship. The manila envelope in her bag had been placed on her dresser like a relic of the day she refused to be small. Then Derek reappeared. He arrived the way small storms do, without much warning, but with a capacity to unsettle everything. He found her coming off a shift near the servants' entrance, words like barbs already sharpened on his tongue. "You thought you could leave everything behind and come here?" he asked, the old contempt folded into the new setting. "You think you can make what you did disappear?" Isabella recognized the smell of hymn-sheep cologne, beer, the half-hope that comes from a man who believes he can reclaim what he had lost by force. She kept her hands in the sleeves of Max's shirt she had learned to wear around the manor, the fabric that still smelled faintly of him. She had not expected Derek to find her here. She had thought she had buried that life in paperwork and distance. He accused her aloud of things he did not have any proof for, accusations about an abortion she had never had. Rumors he invented to shame her. They were cruel in the particular way that aims to render the target powerless. The staff nearby felt the exchange like a wave. Isabella straightened. She had spent so long navigating the fear of being blamed that power was a strange new lesson. She refused to be baited into a spectacle. "You do not get to tell my story," she said. Her voice was level, which had the effect of long cold iron in those who expected spectacle. Derek took a step closer, as if proximity could reset the narrative. The move was the one that had terrorized her in years past, the insinuation that closeness equaled ownership. That violence had been the line she had crossed to leave him before. She felt the old fear flare, quick and poisonous, but she named the present instead. "You will step away," she ordered with the calm of someone who had rehearsed escape plans like prayers. It would have been easy for vengeance to write itself into the scene. Max appeared as if conjured by the atmosphere, a presence that made the air feel measured. He watched Derek with a coldness that was not theatrical. The house had its own authority, and he used it. "Leave," Max said to Derek, with a voice that bore the promise of consequence. "You have no business here." Derek's response was a threat thinly disguised by bravado. "Or what? You'll make me leave." Max's answer showed the line he had decided to draw. He could have chosen between cruelty and mercy, and he chose something that did not fit neatly into boxers of saint or criminal. He issued a decision that carried the weight of both a judge and an enforcer. "You will sign a promise. You will never approach her again. If you do, You will be brought to the attention of the authorities and 2 men who take different measures. You will leave now. His words were exact. There was an edge that suggested he had both legal and non-legal options at his disposal. He was giving Derek a way off a cliff that did not require the house to push him. Derek left, swearing in the way men who lose their illusions will swear. The house's security escorted him to a car waiting beyond the iron gates. He would be exiled in the practical sense, unable to cause immediate harm, a danger diffused by a combination of legal threat and the reputation of the household. Max was careful not to crush a life into a cautionary corpse. He chose exile and a promise of legal consequences rather than a private execution. After Derek's departure, Isabella sat in the staff room and let herself feel an exhausted relief. She had been shielded, but the shelter had not erased her agency. She had told Derek to leave. She had not needed someone else to fend him off entirely. Max's presence had shifted the outcome, but it had not taken her power. That was in line with the bargain between them. Protection, without theft of self. The next weeks unfolded with a new kind of negotiation. Ricardo Isabella's father came back into their orbit in a way that curled the whole family into a knot of old hurts and new possibilities. He had been a ghost for many years, a story told at Rosa's most vulnerable moments, a man who fled with a debt and the shame of leaving. His return was cautious and clumsy. He arrived at the Castellano gates, not as a threat but as a worn figure in need of work and a chance to make amends. Rosa had shielded Isabella from the truth for years, out of shame and fear and the desperate hope that the past would not be forced to reopen. But secrets have a way of insisting on daylight. Ricardo asked for forgiveness, the way someone asks for a map after wandering through fog for too long. He admitted the theft, explained without excusing the pressures that had bent him into a version of a man willing to take a wrong course. The reunion was private and painful. Rosa's face tightened into lines that were older than he had the right to see. She listened to his apologies and did not accept them like a child taking candy. Forgiveness is a laborious craft, not a spontaneous spark, and she required proof. Ricardo understood that. He returned with a desire to earn back the trust he had broken. He took jobs, cleaning the garden and mending fences, the kind of honest labor that pays a slow currency. He showed up at Rosa's bedside with hot water and tea, and for the first time in years, he did not angle his presence for sympathy. He simply did work. He apologized to Isabella in small gestures, a payment plan that he honored, a letter to be sent to those his theft had affected, and the way he answered when she called. Max watched the family's reconciliation with a guarded optimism. He offered Rosa a role that would bring stability rather than control. An overseer position within the household operations that allowed her to command respect and wages that would keep bills paid. Rosa, who had kept dignity in the margins, accepted and began to rebuild her life on a foundation both practical and symbolic. She stood taller as the months went on, moving through halls with the same hands that had once scrubbed floors, now assigning tasks and giving orders that people followed without surprise. Ricardo kept his promise, and slowly the family's nervousness thinned into a cautious trust. Isabella, who had never forgiven entirely, allowed for evidence to accumulate, a man who returned every day, a man who kept his word and did the small, honest things that rebuilt faith and She did not dismiss the scars of abandonment. She simply refused to keep them as the only thing that defined her father. Forgiveness, she learned, was work she could choose to do without erasing the past. As the family mended, Isabella found a new direction. The house's foundation, which Max had been slowly reshaping from a private ledger into a vehicle for public good-offered seed funding toward a program for survivors of domestic abuse. Isabella's own experience became the compass of the initiative. She proposed a modest plan, a clinic within the foundation's community outreach that offered medical care, counseling, referrals, and legal advice to women who needed a way out. Max greenlit it, with practical conditions, measurable goals, community partnerships, and strict oversight. It was not charity in the old-fashioned sense. It was structural work. Isabella ran the program with the same hands that had folded linens and organized medicine. She trained volunteers, linked clients to pro bono legal assistance, and helped coordinate safe housing. The project gave her a kind of authority she had never been afforded before she moved from being invisible labor to someone who led change. The Foundation's program did not erase her past, but it gave it shape. She used her knowledge to build pathways for others, and for the first time she felt a purpose that was not borrowed from necessity, but chosen. The staff who once watched her with curiosity now watched her with a different respect. Their chatter changed subtly, less about gossip, more about logistics. Max watched her in late afternoons, leaning against the banister in the study while she presented metrics to donors about the program's early success. He admired, in a way that did not make a spectacle of his feelings, the steadiness with which she wielded both compassion and discipline. He began to take small but concrete steps to reshape his own life. He enrolled in evening classes at a nearby school, paralegal studies at first, then medical ethics seminars, old textbooks, once touched again by a man who had kept his ledger of choices. He did not announce a conversion. He kept his responsibilities. He used the Foundation's resources to expand outreach, but in doing so, he also accepted that power could be There were consequences to all this. Not everyone in Max's network appreciated the softer edges he was showing. Some associates feared the risk. Others saw opportunity. The house remained a place where the law and the less formal systems of power intersected. Max navigated these currents with the same cautious pragmatism that had guided him when he chose exile over bloodshed for Derek. He did not erase the mechanisms that protected the household, but he did redistribute some of his energies toward building structures that could survive without fear. The relationship between Isabella and Max hovered, in public, in a careful territory. They did not rush declarations. Their intimacy was measured in small gestures. A cup of soup left in the study, a hand that brushed the back of a coat when a storm gusted, a conversation about a treatment plan for a patient in the outreach clinic. They shared moments laced with mutual respect. The flirtation that might have been a headline remained private, and private for a reason. It grew in the spaces where they learned to see each other beyond legend. One evening, after a long day of meetings and schedules, Max invited her to walk the roof garden. The city spread at their feet, a scatter of lights and anonymous lives, and the roof held its own hush, guarded by planters and the city's sound. He brought a thermos of coffee and 2 paper cups, the sort of unpretentious offering that meant more because it was deliberate. They walked among the lavender and small birches he had insisted on planting for their ability to survive. Isabella liked that about the roof, the way the plants clung to a life in a place that could be inhospitable. Their survival felt like a metaphor for people who had been expected not to make it. "You've learned the names of these," she said, touching a leaf. He nodded. "They do well, if you don't try to force them." "So do people," she answered. They spoke of future projects, and of the slow work that still needed to be done. He told her he was thinking seriously now about returning to medical studies in a way that would not require him to abandon the responsibilities he had taken on, but would allow him to honor a path he had once forsaken. She thought of the way he had listened to her in the cellar, and she permitted herself the pleasure of imagining him in lecture halls with a different purpose. It was not a confession of love, not yet. It was an admission that their lives were changing in a manner that required vulnerability. They were both learning a new language for their feelings that did not reduce one to a damsel and the other to a savior. They were 2 people making choices about how to live in a house that had once been a fortress and was becoming a place of work and repair. Months of steady work altered the optics of the mansion. The Foundation's outreach gained recognition. Rosa's promotion to an operations lead created a model of dignity that was mirrored in the staff's own steadiness. Ricardo continued to earn trust, his hands marked with honest labor rather than theft. The house learned to keep both its secrets and its good work with equal care. Then came the evening that marked the small, firm hinge of everything, an announcement that felt like a public recognition of private changes. Max organized a small dinner, not the theatrical launch parties of old, but a modest meal for friends and family. He asked Isabella to help plan the menu, a decision that placed her not as staff, but as partner in hospitality. She accepted, and the planning process felt like a test of how close collaboration could be without pretense. On the night of the dinner, the dining room was lit in a warm way that made the faces around the table look softened. The city leaned in beyond the windows, a distant audience whose approval they did not need. Max sat at the head of the table, attentive in the way that suggested he was listening more for the shape of what was true than for compliments. After the plates were cleared, and the talk had settled into comfortable conversation, he asked for people's attention, but not in the ornate way he might have once, as if to remind the world of his reach. He spoke quietly and simply. "There's work to be done," he said. "There's a foundation to run and projects to grow. There are mistakes to be owned and repaired. I intend to do that work. I also intend to pursue something I set aside a long time ago." He looked at Isabella and then at those gathered, and the steadiness of his gaze suggested that what followed was not a performance but a commitment. "I will be returning to medical studies part-time. I will be responsible for the foundation, and I will ensure the protection of those who work here without retribution or spectacle." Those are actions, not promises. It was a public statement with private consequences. For Isabella, there was a small, almost private rush of exhilaration. It meant the man she had learned to measure as both danger and shelter was making a tangible choice to change his life's work. It meant that protection and transformation could coexist. The final shift came later, on a clear night, with a sky like a polished coin. Max took Isabella to the roof garden where they had walked before. The city's breath was cool. Sophia and Rosa and Ricardo were present. So were a few people whose roles in the house had become more like family than staff. He had arranged a meal, simple and intimate, and he had done it in a way that involved no cameras, no priests-only people who mattered. He took her hand as if it had always been a natural movement. He did not kneel with a flourish. He sat beside her, and in that small lowering there was the gravity of someone who had made careful calculations and chosen the uncertain ground of love anyway. "I didn't come to rescue you," he said. "I didn't come to fix you. I came because I want to be with you in the life you choose. I want to build, not erase. I want to learn to be better in the way that matters." His questions were practical, the kind she respected. "Isabella Reyes, will you marry me? Will you let me be your partner in the choices we make, in the work we do to repair what was broken, and to keep what's sacred?" She looked at the faces around them, the woman who had been promoted, the father who had returned with honest hands, the sister who had read law books in the quiet. She thought of the shirt that had been left at her door as a gesture that could have been ownership but had been protection, of nights in a cellar where they had traded stories instead of scandal, of the clinic that now aided survivors in the city. She thought of the tiny calculus of dignity she had argued for at the gate when she had first arrived. "Yes," she said, and the word had the weight of careful decision. Their lives did not resolve into fairy tale simplicity. There were still critics who whispered, and old friends who wondered whether a man built on a ledger could truly change. There were still choices to be made about how the foundation would be run, about the legalities that circled the house like hawks. But in the small ceremony on the roof, surrounded by a ragged ring of family, she found that the decision was not about rescue, but about partnership. The wedding was not a grand broadcast. It was a modest ceremony that included those who had been part of the journey, the house staff, the friends who had offered practical support, the few donors who believed in work over spectacle. The celebration was an honest meal in the same dining room where Vanessa's accusation had once become fodder for gossip. There was laughter, and there were tears that were not performative, but genuine. Rosa's hands trembled as she placed a napkin on the newlyweds' table, and Ricardo watched with a humility that contained a quiet pride. Months later, the house hummed with a new kind of rhythm. Max divided his time between the foundation and the early lectures he attended, a man who had learned to feel the awkwardness of beginning again. Isabella continued to lead the outreach program, hiring survivors and creating pathways for them to find work and safety. The clinic saw people whom the system had failed before, and it offered them a way forward that involved dignity, not pity. Vanessa's exit had consequences. She kept her public persona, but doors that had once been available to her closed. Derek's exile, Heldy kept his distance, and the legal threat that hung over his head was a practical deterrent rather than a dramatic show. The house had learned to wield power in measured forms rather than authoritarian outbursts. There were small joys. Isabella and Max would sometimes steal breakfast in the kitchen, the both of them in shirts and slippers. the kind of private moments that did more to teach them each other than any public declaration. Isabella would tell him about the clients who had finally moved into stable housing, and he would tell her about the ethics lecture that had reminded him of the reasons he had once loved the idea of medicine. Sophia finished her law degree and began work on cases that aided the Foundation's mandate. Maggie, who had first met Isabella with a measure of suspicion, became a friend who knew the rhythm of the house better than anyone. In a final quiet image, they sat together at a table heavy with food and the smell of rosemary and lemon. The city outside continued its noise, but inside the house, in the kitchen where Isabella had once simply been the worker, there was now a place of shared labor. She looked up at Max, across the table, and he caught her hand with the same care with which he had once handed over an envelope of wages. They were not perfect. They did not pretend to be. They had scars and ledgers and networks that required careful tending, but Isabella had kept her agency throughout. She had made choices that reshaped her life, rather than allowing events to decide her destiny. Max had not been absolved by loving. He had been altered by the practice of new choices. The house, once a fortress of secrecy, held both the amber of tradition and the fresh shoots of repair. On a Sunday afternoon, with the windows open and Rosa humming in the kitchen, Isabella stood at the modest window that overlooked the garden and thought of the moment at the gate when she had bargained for dignity. When she had said no to the uniform and yes to being paid fairly, she had not imagined where that single bold move might lead. The slap, the shirt, the cellar conversations, the wine launch, Derek's exile, Ricardo's return, all of it had been the messy arithmetic of change. She had come to the Castellano mansion to keep a job for a week so her mother could get better. She had come to be invisible. Instead, her refusal to be small forced a house to account for the way it treated those who kept it. She had changed a world not by heroics, but by insisting on her worth in the smallest transactions, a price for labor, a refusal of humiliation, a steady hand in a cellar. In doing so, she had shocked a man who thought in Ledgerzan that shock had shifted him toward choices that mattered. Their life went on in scenes small and large, dinners that felt like home, guests who came and left, the steady work of the Foundation. Isabella's bold move at the gates and in the ballroom had not been spectacle. It was a pivot point for a life lived fully instead of one kept small. In the end, what changed everything was not a single melodramatic moment but a series of decisions made by people tired of pretending weakness was an acceptable currency. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more full-length romance dramas.